everybody. Welcome to today's episode of Building Worlds in Unreal. Today we're going to focus on creating landscapes. So the first thing that we're going to do is come into here in Unreal and we're going to create a brand new map. So I'm going to go File, New Level. And in this case, I am going to create a landscape, or I'm going to create a map that does time of day. All right, so here I am in my new map. And since we're going to go over landscapes today, the first thing that we need to do in our new map is create a landscape. So I'm going to come up here to the top left and I'm going to select modes, and that's going to open up this little menu, and I'm going to pick the landscape mode. Now at this point we haven't created anything yet. This green grid that we see is a preview that's going to show us what we will be creating once we hit the create button right here. So Unreal gives us the opportunity to experiment with the size and divisions of the landscape before we create it. A landscape is a large uniform grid of vertices. Each vertex represents a point on the landscape. When creating a new landscape, Unreal assumes that we want a vertex density of 1 vertex per meter. So as you adjust the settings, it keeps this spacing. If you want to control the grid density, the only control that you have at this stage is the scale setting here. I recommend that you leave the scale alone for now. We'll stick with 1 vertex per meter for now and adjust it later after the grid is created. I'll show you that in a minute, but for now just keep in mind that every grid square here, every little green square that we're looking at, is 1 meter. And here at the bottom where it says overall resolution, that is the size approximately in meters that we're going to create for our grid. So let's zoom out here a little bit. Now for efficiency, Unreal breaks the grid into sections and components. A component is the largest unit of the grid, and you can see the components here outlined in this bright green color. The actual quads, or individual little squares, use the dark green, but the components are outlined in light green. Each component has a CPU cost to render, so you can make your landscape more efficient by reducing the number of components you use. One method for reducing the number of components is to control the component number directly. So here we see number of components, and I've got 8, and I can increase it and decrease it, but you can see that as I change this value, the actual size of the landscape is changing. So if I set this to 4 by 4 in order to reduce the number of components, now I also have only a quarter of the available landscape size that I did before. What if I want to keep the landscape the same size but still reduce the number of components? That's where this section size comes in. And sections per component can also help with that. So by default we have 1 section per component. But it's also possible to change this setting, so we'll have 4 sections per component. If I drop this down and pick 2 by 2, now you can see that our components are split up and divided so that there are 4 sections in each component. You can see that a section is outlined kind of by this medium green color. Our components are the light green color and our individual quads are the dark green color. So, and I don't know if you noticed, but when I switch back and forth between 1 section per component and 2 or 4 sections per component, it now doubles the size of my landscape. So whereas before I had 8 components by 8 components and 1 section per component, if I choose 2 sections per component, it doubles the size, and now I can reduce my components down to 4 by 4 and get the same size of landscape. So I used to have 64 total components, and now I just have 16, but I have the same landscape size. And that's going to help me save on some CPU costs. That's a really nice cost savings there. Another control I have is the section size here. it defaults to 63 by 63 quads per section. And this controls the number of quads or grid squares that we have in each section. Since the quads are set to 1 meter size, increasing this will set the size of the section instead of increasing the quad density. I'm going to double this value from 63 up to 127, and notice that my landscape doubled in size again. And now, to keep it the same size, I can either switch my sections back to 1 section per component, or I can reduce my number of components down to 2 by 2. And now, after increasing the section size and decreasing the number of components, I've got the same size landscape, but I've reduced the total number of components down to 4. So you might think that I just want to set my components down to 1 and then set my quad size up to 256 or 255, and now I only have 1 component overall, and I have the same size landscape. So this will create the lowest cost on the CPU, but there is a downside to having large sections. When you're playing the game, as you get further away from a section, Unreal will reduce its quality to save performance on the GPU. Larger sections don't reduce as well as smaller ones, so a large section will cost more on the GPU than a small one. The challenge is to find a combination of component count and section size that's a balance between CPU and GPU cost. A good rule of thumb is to make sections larger on larger landscapes and make them smaller on smaller landscapes. Now, luckily for us, Epic has created a really nice table in their documentation that has a nice set of optimized settings for many different sizes of landscapes. So here you can just pick the size of the landscape that you want in this left column, and then it has all of the rest of the settings already outlined for us, so we don't have to figure out and do all the crazy balancing between CPU and GPU. We can just use the settings that they've already come up with. So let's jump back to Unreal, and we're going to go ahead and use the default setting of 63 quads, 1 section per component, and 8 by 8 components. And that's going to give us a terrain or a landscape that's roughly 1/2 kilometer by 1/2 kilometer. Now you might be saying, well, heck no, I want to jump in and create an 8 kilometer by 8 kilometer terrain and just make this huge, amazing, awesome world. Well, what I recommend is that we start out small and create a couple of little landscapes and then move on to something bigger. And this is kind of like creating a bunch of thumbnail drawings before painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So once you've done several little practice areas, you can take what you've learned and make something huge. So we're going to stick with the default settings of 63 by 63, 1 section per component, and 8 by 8 components with an overall resolution of 505 by 505. And now, all we need to do is hit the Create button. And Unreal just built a beautiful landscape for us. Now I'm going to zoom in back here to the center of the map, and you can see that our initial little square that we had created is kind of buried under the terrain. In order to fix that, I can go back to Select Mode, select our landscape, and we're just going to move our landscape down to 0 instead of 100. And now our initial little cube is no longer buried. All right, let's talk about vertex density or landscape resolution for a minute. I'm going to switch over to wireframe mode, and you can see that now we can take a look at the density of our terrain. And right now the landscape is set to a density of 1 vertex per meter. And this might work well for some things, but what I really like to do is increase the density so that we can have more details, so that when we're sculpting our terrain, so that when we're painting our materials, we can make changes more frequent than just once per meter. And so the way that we can do that is come up here to Modes, go back to Landscape, select the Manage tab, and then come here to the Resize button. And now this will allow us to change the layout of our landscape without actually having to delete the landscape and start over. So here I have section size, and I've got my section size set to 63 by 63. Now before I created the landscape, when we were looking at that nice green grid, if I were to change this section size, it would actually increase the size of our section. But now what I can do is increase this section size, and instead of increasing the size of the section, as long as I have resize mode set to resample, this is going to increase the density of the section here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit apply here. And you can see that now I have significantly more detail on my landscape. Now you might be saying, oh man, that is just totally going to kill the performance. And you're right. In normal situations, especially if I look off here toward the horizon, that is an incredibly dense landscape, and I wouldn't want to do that. And so what I'm going to do is, in order to make up for the increase in density close to the camera, I'm going to reduce the amount of density that I have further away. So the way that we're going to do that is I'm going to go ahead and select my landscape, and I'm going to come over here to my law distribution settings. And these are the settings that I have to control the way that my detail falls off as I get further away from the landscape. Let's just zoom out here, and you can see that as I get further away, Unreal reduces the density of the detail. The quads actually change so that it's drawing fewer quads as I got further away. But with our current settings, you can see that our landscape is still really dense. I have way too many vertices here for the distance that I am. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust these settings to reduce the amount of density at this distance. So first I'm going to change my Lot 0 screen size from 0.5 to 1.5, and you can see that my density was reduced. Now I'm going to set my Lot 0 setting from 1.25 down to 1. And again, the density is reduced some more. And I'm going to set my other LODs from 3 down to 1.7. And now you can see that I have significantly less detail here when I'm further away, but more detail is added in as I get closer and closer, until finally when I'm as close as I want to be up here, I'm getting that 4 verts per meter that I really want, that really tight detail close up. But as soon as I move back, you can see that the detail is removed, and I'm able to get a nice balance between tight detail up close and less detail further away, which is exactly what I want. In games, when you're troubleshooting or when you're trying to increase performance, what you want to do is to be able to give the player a lot of really nice detail close up, but get rid of that detail further away where it can't be seen. So that's what we've done here. And so now we're going to be able to paint, we're going to be able to sculpt our current terrain and paint our materials with a lot of tight detail close up, and the detail will be removed for us by the game engine when we get further away. So that's a pretty cool feature. All right, the next thing that we want to do is talk about sculpting the terrain. But before we get too far into that, I want to come up here and do File, Save Current As. And I'm going to give our map a name just so that we can save it right now. So I'm going to name this my new map, and we'll go ahead and save that. Now what I want to do is switch back to the other map that I was working on, and this is the example. This one's called Landscape Test. And we're just going to take a look at this really quick. And so I want to show you what we're going for. So here's a little creek that I created. And basically this is just a little depression in the landscape with a nice little creek flowing through it. And this is the goal. This is what we want to create. So I wanted to take a look at this and show you. And then we can jump back into our map and do something similar. Maybe even a little bit better than this. We'll see. The other thing I want you to notice is that I have this mannequin character standing here. And the reason that I have him in my scene is just for scale. Scale is something that's really important. And so when we jump back into our other map, I'm going to add this mannequin into that scene so that we can see how big things are. If we don't have something that is recognizable as an everyday object, it's really hard to know how big and small we're making things. And so it's important to have this guy in here or something else that we know the actual size of so that we have everything, so that we have something to base the size of everything else on. So let's switch back to our other map. And we'll go ahead and add our mannequin in. So I'm going to come down here to the content browser at the bottom. And I have this folder called Mannequin, Characters, Meshes, and here's my SK mannequin, so I can just drag him into the scene. And you can see how the mannequin is a little bit smaller than maybe that you thought the scene was. And that's because this render ball here is actually much larger than you probably thought. So now with the mannequin in the scene, it's really easy to see how big I need to make my stream. So like I said, it's important to have this real world reference so that you know how big and small to make things in your scene. If you don't have the mannequin folder here, you can come here to add new and then add features or content pack and just pick the third person, and this will include the mannequin character. So once you hit add, then you'll have a mannequin folder here and you can add that. All right, so let's jump into sculpting terrain. I'm just going to zoom out here to give myself a little bit more space. And we're going to come up to Modes, Landscape, and then click on this Sculpt tab. And now what this gives you access to is a whole bunch of tools for controlling the shape of your terrain. We're going to start out by talking about the Sculpt tool. What this allows you to do is to raise and lower the terrain. So I'm going to pick Sculpt. And you can see that I have this white circle here. This white circle shows me what parts of the landscape I'm actually going to be influencing when I paint. So if I click and drag, you can see that it's actually raising parts of the terrain. And the more that I paint on this, the higher that gets. So you can see that I've made a nice little hill for my mannequin guy now. And I'm raising the terrain. What if I want to lower the terrain? I can use the same Sculpt tool and just hold down the Shift key, and that will lower the terrain. So now I'm kind of pushing down the hill that I created. And over here on the left, I have controls that control my brush. So this is how much power I want to put behind it. So if I turn this way up, and then Sculpt, you can see that now when I raise the terrain, it's raising it a lot more. I can also control my brush size. So right now my brush is set to 5 meters, but I can reduce it. So if I want to create something that's even smaller than a meter, I can set my brush size really small. And also here is my brush fall off. So this is kind of the softness. You can see that right now the white circle in the middle there has a nice little fall off at the edges. But if I turn the fall up all the way up to 1, it's even softer. And if I turn it down to 0, now my brush has a really hard edge and it's going to create really sharp features. So it's really nice to be able to control the settings of the brush like this to create smooth brushes or hard brushes, and also to be able to control the size of the brush that you're using to paint on your terrain. All right, so we've got a tool that raises it, and if we hold shift, we can lower it. What if we want to get rid of what we've done? We have kind of messed up our terrain a little bit here, and for that we have the Flatten tool. And what this does is wherever I click first, it's going to take that height and it's going to paint that height across wherever I stroke the brush. So if I click here in a flat area and then paint here across the areas where I've already painted, you can see that I'm getting rid of what I did before. It's kind of like using an eraser. If I click here in the flat area, then it brings everything up to that level, and it also takes things down to that level. So if I sculpt something kind of high here, and then I go to flatten and click here where it's flat, and then go across that, it will reduce that that big, large, kind of bumpy, mountainy area to the flat that I've selected. Just the same, if I have a large bumpy area and I pick flatten and I click first in that area, it's going to flatten everything up to wherever I clicked first. So this is nice if you have kind of a mountainy area and you know there's going to be some combat in a specific spot, and you need to kind of level out that area so that it can be open for some gameplay to take place. You can use this nice flatten tool. I'm just going to go ahead and go over my terrain and just kind of flatten everything out here so we can get back to what we had before. All right, if you have some nice rolling hills and soft, smooth details, let's just go ahead and add some soft, smooth details here. And this is looking like a little bit too smooth and soft. You can use this noise tool to go ahead and bump things up. So I'm just going to zoom in here so that you can see a little bit better what it does. But right now, these rolling hills are kind of smooth. But if I click on noise, you can see that it's just going to kind of rough things up and add in some more noisiness to my surface. It's kind of adding crazy bumps and ridges and things. And so this is a good way to add additional tight detail. And there's all kinds of controls over here to change the scale and the size of the noise, which is pretty cool. The opposite of the noise tool is the smooth tool. So if something is too rough and bumpy, you can use smooth tool to kind of soften it out. And you can see that it just kind of melts everything and gets rid of noise. I'm going to reduce the strength of this a little bit so they can get a better idea of what's going on. So if I just go over this, you can see that that tight noise that used to be there is completely going away. So I'm just going to kind of smooth things out, and it just averages whatever you're painting with whatever is around it. So it removes really tight detail and leaves you with the broad overall smooth detail. So there's some really nice controls there for painting terrain. Be able to get the look that you want with Sculpt, Smooth, Flatten, and Noise. Now there's some other tools here, and I'm going to post a link in the description to the documentation that Unreal gives so that you can go ahead and take some homework for yourself and play around with what these other tools do: ramp, erosion, hydro, etc. But for now, what we need to do is make our little creek. So I'm going to come over here just to give myself a little space, and I'm going to pick this Sculpt tool and maybe increase the tool size just a little bit. And we want to make our creek kind of an indentation, so I'm going to hold down Shift and kind of paint along here, maybe curve it around. So we're going to make a creek kind of flowing through the landscape here. And I'm just going to kind of keep painting. curve it just a little bit. So this creek's going to be a little bit longer than the other one that I created. You can just kind of keep painting to indent this creek into our landscape. And now I'm going to paint without holding shift. I'm just going to raise up the sides around the creek a little bit. To make it feel a little bit more natural. Maybe lower this part here. And then raise up the banks a bit. All right, that's not too bad. Now maybe I'll use the smoothness tool just a little bit. I'm going to switch over to smoothness, and I'm going to turn the tool strength down quite a bit because I just want to smooth out the largest details. I'm going to shrink my brush down as well. So I did get a little bit of noisiness in here, and I want to get rid of some of that, so I'm just going to go over it with the smoothness tool to kind of smoothen it out. One thing that I forgot to mention, just kind of while I'm doing this, is when you first create a landscape, unless you provide it an initial material, the landscape is going to come with this nice gray checkerboard on it. And in future videos, we're going to be talking about creating a landscape material. In fact, I think that's what we'll dive into next week. Unless you guys have some major questions about sculpting terrain, I think we're just going to go ahead and start talking about landscape materials next week. And that topic is a little bit complicated, and so it'll probably take us a couple of weeks to get through it. But we're going to do some cool things, like I'm going to show you how to download some materials from Quixel Megascans, and how to format the materials and how to optimize them. And we're going to go over several different techniques for getting rid of tiling in the distance on the landscape. So that's going to be pretty cool. I think we've got pretty decent riverbed here. One thing that I do want to mention about landscapes is a lot of people make landscapes using height maps, and that is a really good idea to download height map data from geological surveys. There are a lot of different sites available on the internet where you can get real world height map data, and that's really cool. You can actually bring in real world topology data from the earth and apply it to your landscapes in Unreal. That's something that we're going to go over in a future episode. For this section of the tutorial where we're talking about building the creek, we're just going to go ahead and stick with the height maps that we've painted. But in a future episode, we're going to talk about how to bring in height maps from real world data and create terrain that actually mimics real world places. So that's going to be a neat episode. I hope you're looking forward to that. The last thing that we're going to do today is actually play the game that we've started to create. So I'm going to come up here to World, and we're going to pick World Settings. And under Game Mode Override, we're going to pick Third Person Game Mode. Now if I come up here and I press play, you can see that we've got our little mannequin in our scene, and I've started out on my beginning platform, but I can use third-person game controls, W to move forward as I hold down the right mouse button to look around, and I can run my mannequin around my scene. And I can jump with the spacebar, and you can see that here is the little stream bed that we created, and you can get a good idea for how big this area is by running around with your mannequin. Now this is important because if you create something that's too large or too small, and like for right now, I can see that I've made this kind of too deep. So I'm probably going to go ahead and fix this before the next episode. But my mannequin is kind of stuck down here in my stream bed, and I want to play test this as I'm going along, even at this really early stage, so that I get the terrain or the landscape the right shape for my player. And so it's really important that as you go along each step of the way that you're playtesting, to make sure that your landscape is doing what you need it to, and especially that things are the correct distance away. If you create a game where your player has to just run forever in a direction, the player's going to get really bored. So you want to make sure that you're jumping in here with your mannequin and playtesting your game, so that you can ensure that you're getting a good balance between things being really far apart and not making your player really bored as you're running around. All right, like I said, next week we're going to talk about starting to create materials for our landscape. So I hope you come back for that. Be sure to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and we'll see you next week, everybody.